and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. For many of us who grew up on the Cold War as the security environment, Australia escapes our strategic notice since so often we focused on Northern and Western Hemisphere conflict. And yet, as this week's Horns guest, Charles Edel, inaugural Australia Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., explains, Australia has undergone a strategic revolution and is becoming an increasingly important partner to the United States in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. Edel outlines the sources of that revolution as well as its implications and looks at the natural partnership between Australia and the United States as we face a future of likely great power competition with China. This event was recorded at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
Thanks so much for the really warm welcome for all of you guys coming out to Rhonda for the wonderful dinner that we had last night, for Jeremy for drinks, and just for being such a good friend and mentor, and Elizabeth and the entire team. Thank you guys for having me out here. Now, look, over the years, I've been lucky enough to come down to the Clements Center, to UT Austin, and out to Beaver Creek for the summer sessions a number of different times where we discuss what I love discussing: history, strategy, and statecraft. But I have to admit, this is my very first engagement with the Clark Center for Australia and New Zealand Studies and for the new-ish Asia Policy Program. And in fact, when we started discussing this talk a couple of months ago, I was asked if I wanted to take a break from talking about John Quincy Adams, from the lessons of Greek tragedy and what it holds for today's international relations, and even from U.S.-China, and more or less talk about my day job. And I said I would be delighted to do so, because my day job, as Sheena just explained it, is serving as the inaugural Australia Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Now, I came to that role, as you just heard in my bio, after having served at the University of Sydney, where I was working at a think tank that they had on campus, the U.S. Study Center, which is like my very humble brag way of telling you that I'm bilingual. I can speak both American and Australian. And in fact, this is part of my job description, because when we moved to Sydney, so we were there for about 3.5 years or so. We went in the summer of 2017, winter 2017, right? They're the Southern Hemisphere. It's always an adjustment for me too. At the U.S. Study Center, my job was talking about and attempting, I underscore attempting, to explain our crazy country to our good Australian friends. And over the last 3, 4, 5 years, this was no easy task, I will say. But now that we're back in Washington and I've set up shop at CSIS, it's funny because I feel like my job description is almost inverted 180 degrees. Now my job is to attempt to translate Australian into American policy speak and explain what's happening in Australia domestically with a particular focus on their foreign policy and national security. I am not only the inaugural Australia Chair at CSIS, I'm the inaugural Australia Chair anywhere in Washington because there has been no program that has dedicated resources and scholarly attention to Australia, which, when you think of it, is a little bit surprising given the importance of Australia to the United States. And so let me just start with a couple of basic facts for you. The U.S. is by far the number one investor into Australia, and U.S. firms are number one when it comes to total employment, exports, capital expenditure, job creation, and contributions to the GDP in Australia. Similarly, Australia in turn invests more in the United States than it does anywhere else. The US and Australia have been treaty allies since 1951, and we have fought side by side in every war for more than the last 100 years. Our cultures are largely complementary, and our values, shared commitment to rule of law, religious liberty, free speech and debate, or democracy in a word, provide the foundation for both of our, I think, prosperity and security. When we were living in Australia, I regularly got asked by friends over there, how important are we? right? This is the question that allies ask abroad all the time. And my response, diplomatic as always, was, that's a ridiculous question. We do not keep a list in a drawer somewhere where we rank order our allies. But if we did, you'd be moving up the queue. And since we returned to the U.S., and particularly so over the last year, with the advent of AUKUS, this large submarine deal, it's not just submarines, and we'll talk about that too. But it's really taken on a new dimension and turbocharged the U.S.-Australian alliance, making it really at the cutting edge of how the U.S. thinks about the Indo-Pacific region. And I would ask you at the very outset of this talk not to take my word for this, or really for anything. President Biden last September, when he was announcing AUKUS, said that the United States has no closer or more reliable ally than Australia. And Kurt Campbell, who's the National Security Asia Czar, who's running Asia policy across the U.S. government, said when we were actually launching the Australia chair back in January that, quote, moving forward, everything we do of consequence in the Indo-Pacific will do with Australia. Now, look, there's a really interesting history here of both Americans and Australians interacting with and working with each other. After all, we're both former British colonies. We both have quite a history of riding roughshod over our indigenous populations. We're both continent-sized nations with similar cultures, and we're the closest of allies. There are a lot of similarities here to talk about. But what I think makes this relationship so interesting right now, which is why I think Kurt Campbell said that everything we do, let me say this again, that we do in the Indo-Pacific, we're going to do in lockstep with Australia, is because of the strategic revolution that Australia has been having and the consequences to their conception of national security. And it's to that end that I thought I would really spend the majority of my comments when we're talking together, attempting to explain that strategic revolution, what it is, why it's occurred, what's happening with their new government. They had an election back in May, and why this matters actually to America. And then I should say I want to race through these comments. I'll give you good comments, but I want to race through them because I'm really interested in hearing what it is that all of you want to talk about. We can talk about any aspect of the relationship or alliance or all the, as we were discussing at dinner last night, deadly flora and fauna that exist in Australia. Okay, first a word, though, about the title of this talk, which Sheena read off, A Pacific Plan of Strategy. The phrase actually comes from a landmark speech given by Australia's wartime Prime Minister, John Curtin. In a late 1941 article, late December, he wrote an article called The Task Ahead, in which he wrote about the enormous challenges that were facing Australia at that moment as Japan advanced unimpeded across the Pacific and right towards them. No longer, he declared, could Australia count on Britain being there for it. We had the assault on Singapore was starting. Britain was already starting to draw its resources out of the Pacific and back towards the Atlantic theater. And instead, Curtin said that Australia must now turn to and work with the United States. This was, however, not the easiest of tasks. First of all, think about the strategic environment that they were facing. To that point, when he gave this speech, Japan, an expansionist power, had faced a permissive security environment. They had not suffered one setback or blow at all. The leaders of Japan were really convinced that they could do anything they wanted, wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and that had immediate consequences for Australia's territorial sovereignty, no less its sense of security. Again, I note the dates on this speech because this is before the Battle of the Coral Sea, right, which checked the Japanese advance for the first time. But that might have been the easy part, checking the Japanese advance, because the harder part was actually making sure that the United States cared and was willing to expend resources to Australia. Curtin had to decide how to convince Americans of the strategic importance of Australia. Yes, for Australia's sake, obviously from his perspective, but also from America's perspective. And he sent an envoy to Washington, D.C., and That envoy kind of made the rounds, was networking, and ended up in the Oval Office. And there he was speaking with FDR. And he said, we really need you to help commit resources to us. Look what's coming our way. And FDR's response, I won't quiz Jeremy on this, was go fish. Again, this is prior to Pearl Harbor, note. But he said that if war were to break out in the Pacific, Australians should not count on Americans' help, limited resources, threats and dangers closer to home. And here I'm quoting FDR's somewhat salty language. He said that, not to mention Australia is a hell of a way off. And yet these attempts persisted and they ended up being successful. And so successful that Australia was really converted into the base in the Pacific from which Douglas MacArthur would lead the Allied efforts, Australian, American, Kiwi, and others, to begin the march back up north. Now, one of the things that's always really interesting when you talk about World War II in Australia is the quiz that you ask is how many Americans served in Australia during World War II? Actually, it's such an interesting question. No Australians get the answer correct. I'm curious if any Americans know. Sir?
1 million.
You got it. You nailed it. 1 million Americans rotated through Australia during World War II. The size of the population was only like 10 times that. It's a remarkable number. And really the bonds of the alliance started there and were, of course, formalized in the early years of the Cold War with the ANZUS Treaty in 1951. But look, that's history, and that's not really what I want to spend time talking about today, because I told you I wanted to talk about the strategic revolution that's occurring in Australia right now. In July of this year, Richard Marles, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, and in case he's not busy enough with that portfolio, is also the Defense Minister. He came to CSIS in his first conversation in America, and he said that Australia faces the most complex strategic environment since World War II. Angus Houston, who used to be the commander-in-chief of the ADF, the Australian Defence Forces, he's now being, by the way, dragged back into government because he's running, co-running a strategic defense review that is on kind of fast-forward motion for them. He went even further, and he said that the current strategic circumstances are, quote, the worst I've seen in my career and lifetime. Now, I would note that these assessments didn't come out of nowhere, and they're not just because the Labour Party came into power that they've decided that something is happening that they need to be aware of. In fact, to understand where this assessment of a rapidly deteriorating security environment comes from, I want to turn the clock back just a little bit for you, and I need to mention the C word, and it rhymes with China. So it wasn't that long ago that Australians, and for that matter, many Americans, had a much rosier view of China. In 2014, Xi Jinping visited Australia, gave a speech in Parliament House in Canberra where he talked about an era of friendship, goodwill, and prosperity. That last part mattered a lot. From 2009 to 2019, Australian exports to China tripled to $110 billion a year, accounting for as much as 40% of Australia's exports. As much as 40% of Australia's exports anywhere in the world. I underscore that because Australia is the most trade-dependent advanced economy in the entire world on China. And as China grew, as it modernized, Australia became wealthy because most of those exports are commodities, largely things that are dug out of the ground and shipped north that fueled China's growth. You'll hear commonly a narrative in Australia that Australia, until COVID hit, is the only advanced economy in the world that had uninterrupted growth. It weathered 2008 and the downturn because of its booming trade with Asia and more specifically with China. In fact, they had 30 years of uninterrupted growth in the black, dating back to 1991. So prosperity means a lot to the relations. But Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, cautioned a while ago that there's another side to Australia's relationship with China and that can be characterized by two different poles. fear and greed. And if you look at the greed factor or just the profit-making factor, I think that's only half of the story. And while China, over the 2008, we can say, to the present period, was becoming more internally repressive and more externally aggressive, that is not the main concern for many Australians and Australian policymakers. The main concern that began to change how Australia thought about its own place in its set of policies was what was happening inside of Australia. Now, for those of you who have tracked this, and when I say inside of Australia, I'm talking specifically about multiple instances of China and the Chinese state reaching into and attempting to shape and in many cases stifle democratic processes inside of Australia. It's a really interesting story. In fact, Australia is like the leading candidate in this story. But in case you haven't tracked this quite so closely, let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Beijing, in some very well publicized cases, was attempting to bribe several Australian politicians. It made multiple threats against the Chinese diaspora living inside of Australia, including, in a rather famous case, telling the leaders of the opposition, Labour Party, who are now the government, that if they did not carry out and support policies that Beijing wanted, they would work to weaponize the ethnically Chinese Australian population against them inside of Australia. We're talking about hacking the systems and the political parties inside of Australia. We're talking about attempts to silence debate on university campuses for issues that were antithetical to China, sometimes violently, and oftentimes with control reaching into Chinese consulates around the country. We're talking about detention of Australian citizens traveling inside of China. We're talking about, and I imagine many people know about this, the wave of economic coercion that came at Australia after they called for an international investigation into the origins of COVID. And again, that 40% figure of trade should resonate here because there was the potential for a lot of leverage to be there. And perhaps most galling of all, after the pandemic had started, the Chinese embassy in Canberra leaked, not very quietly, as things deteriorated, as economic coercion came on, a list of 14 points, not Wilson's 14 points, but of 14 points to the Australian public about what Australia would need to do to rectify its behavior if it wanted to get things back on track. I'm going to give you a sketch of what those 14 points were, but they included stop criticizing us in your newspapers, stop having parliamentary debate that attacks China, stop funding any think tanks that do independent research that portrays China in a bad light, stop talking poorly about China. I mean, what we're basically talking about is silencing debate within Australia about China. Now, I laid that out in case you're not familiar with that, but what's been very interesting is that over the last several years is how Australia has chosen to respond. Now, you might think that, and I think we can make a pretty credible case that Beijing thought that you could see a causal mechanism, right? Lots of economic leverage potentially. Therefore, if you squeeze that economic power and leverage that you have over them, that will translate into political compliance, right? And this is not even a theory. Good friends of mine who worked for the foreign minister or the prime minister said that back in the heyday of kind of good relations, 2015 or 16, when the Australian foreign minister or the Australian prime minister said something that might be construed as mildly critical of China, like we don't like what's happening in the South China Sea, let's uphold international law, you could set a clock from the time that that statement was made till a phone call came in from a Western Australian mining executive who sold much of their product to China saying, would you please be quiet about what's happening? Right? So this wasn't a crazy theory. And yet the way that Australia has chosen to respond has been really interesting. It barred Huawei and ZTE from building out its 5G networks, the first country in the world to do so. It implemented strong, it actually had none, foreign interference legislation about who could take money and from whom and how transparent you had to be. It tightened screening of foreign investment that was coming into the country. All of this country agnostic, even though we know who is really targeted towards. It made calls to resist economic coercion and push to diversify who it traded with. It called for that investigation into the origins of COVID-19. And what it has really done, and this is what I want to turn my attention to, is increased its defense spending and its diplomatic footprint around its region. In July of 2020, Australia issued a defense strategic update. Don't be fooled by the very bland sounding name. I can speak Australian, I told you that. This is a really important document, and if you want to understand where AUKUS comes from, this, not AUKUS, is the major muscle movement. The document did not call out Beijing specifically, but the cause of the erosion of regional stability is hardly a mystery. It notes that military modernization in the Indo-Pacific has accelerated faster than envisioned. Again, I can speak Australian, that means China. And specifically, China's explosive investment and growth into its military modernization. Scott Morrison, who was the prime minister at the time, repeatedly referenced the 1930s when he rolled this defense strategic update out, and I think that was very deliberate. In his narrative, Australia was insufficiently aligned with other democracies, poorly armed, and unwilling to meaningfully resist acts of aggression. I am a historian. I love history, and I love talking about history and historical analogies as we do at the Clements Center all the time. But this is politics, and history was here being used deliberately to advance several new policy prescriptions about what Australia wanted to avoid, and therefore what it was going to do that it hadn't done before. And that means aligning itself more closely than it had in the past with the United States and other democracies, making sure it was well armed and capable of standing up to, and in certain cases, of pushing back against acts of aggression. And that was the basis, that speech and that document, for the call for Australia in the midst of a pandemic, right, where every other country in the world is looking about how you lock down your spending so you can push it onto the domestic scene, for them massively increasing what they were spending on defense. They, I believe, laid out that they would increase spending $270 billion. That's in Australian. It's still a lot of money over the next 10 years. And the main takeaways here of what they were doing is that due to changing circumstances in their near abroad, in their neighborhood, Australia was no longer seeing the greatest security threat that it was facing emanating from the Middle East or elsewhere, but coming from its own backyard. And therefore, it needed to adopt its strategy, make it more regionally focused, and make itself a harder target for those who were willing to coerce it. That's in the military dimension, but I would also note to you that if you only look at the military dimension, you're missing what Australia has been doing, because their diplomacy has really gone into overdrive over the last year. Yes, there was AUKUS announced about a year ago, but they signed a new agreement with Japan this in January of this year, granting kind of reciprocal access to bases between Australia and Japan. There was the upgrade of the relationship between Australia and South Korea, including the largest purchase of Australia, $1 billion for self-propelled howitzers of any Asian nation they'd ever purchased from before. If we look beyond the defense realm, they signed a free trade agreement with Britain. They've upgraded their relations with both India and with Indonesia. If you look on the multilateral front, yes, there's the obvious Quad right in front of us, right, which they've really been helping to drive on this. But you can also look at their efforts in other areas in the commercial area. The Chinese telco, Australians abbreviate everything, telecommunications company, Digicel was funded by the government $1.6 billion to make sure that it went into the Pacific, to make sure that those networks, that 5G architecture in Papua New Guinea and Tahiti, Tonga, Nauru, and Samoa were funded not by Huawei and China. And along the way, Australia's been giving itself new tools, right? I mean, obviously pouring money into the defense budget, which I talked about, but also pouring resources into cyber. Australia has one of the most advanced offensive cyber capabilities in the world, but also giving themselves more domestic tools too. Like they finally passed a global Magnitsky regime, which they have used first against Russia, but are looking at other areas as well. So zooming out, what I really want to say is that what makes Australia so interesting at this point is both what they're doing with the United States and what they're doing independent of the United States, doubling down on the region and giving itself more tools to resist coercion. Now, I noted that there was an election in May. So one might ask, okay, that was the last government. Where is the new government on this, right? When you work in foreign policy, everyone wants to know what's the difference between a Democratic and a Republican administration. The same question should be asked about partners around the world, particularly of close allies. Interestingly, it was a pretty sharp election, I'm an American, you can hear that in my accent. Australians talked about how exhausted they were from their election. I roll my eyes just a little bit because it was like a 6-week election, and I would give my left arm and probably my right too if we had only 6-week elections. But it was a pretty brutal election, and the critique was fairly stiff. But the Labor government, again, let me do some 101ing for Americans. Labor is the party of the center left. Liberal is the party of the center right. Labor wears red. Liberals wears blue. It's completely backwards from how we do things, but just so you know, right? So the critique when it came to foreign policy was there was no critique, right? One, I think politically wanting to avoid being accused of being soft in a much more tough environment. But actually, Anthony Albanese, who is now the prime minister, when he was asked, how do you differentiate yourself from the current party? He said, if there's a criticism that I have to levy on the current government, it isn't about substance. It's about rhetoric, it's about tone, and it's about delivery, right? So they, on Quad, on Huawei, on AUKUS, there is no difference, and we actually see continuity there. But it's not like there are actually no differences between parties. In fact, foreign policy became a bigger issue, right? Foreign policy, for those of us who study it, is always the most important issue, and it's seldom a deciding issue in elections at democratic states. But this particular election in Australia probably had foreign policy as more pronounced than in any election in at least 2 decades. And that's because, amongst other things, the Chinese moves in and across the Pacific Islands, including right on the doorstep of Australia, grabbed everyone's attention, and particularly in the Solomon Islands. And Penny Wong, who is now the foreign minister, said when she was in opposition and when she was campaigning that this was the greatest security failure and strategic failure in the past 70 years. There was critique of the past government for being insufficiently tuned in to climate policy and insufficiently ambitious. There was a critique that it's really good if you want to pay attention to the Pacific, but if you've been cutting your aid and development budgets over the past decade, how do you actually convince yourself that you're going to be able to do anything on that? And there also emerged differences on prioritization of efforts. The Labor government said that they would really bring the Pacific and Southeast Asia to the fore. And of course, there was a critique that the past government, which might have recognized the challenge, made a lot of announcements and wasn't able to deliver on any of them. Their timeline was too slow. So, in fact, there were some real differences. And I won't in outset go through what's happened, but they took power in May. And the surprising thing is, I think probably against the wishes, this has become a foreign policy administration. The number of trips and travel by the foreign minister, the defense minister, the prime minister is really high at the outset of an administration. In fact, so high, I'll give you this anecdote to underscore my point. The way that an Australian election works is if the outcome is clear, it takes a while to count all the seats. You then have to go to the Governor General, the Queen's representative, to be sworn in as a government. That happens for the leader. Then they appoint their cabinet. This is a process that in the past generally takes about a week or so. It was clear that Anthony Albanese had won, and they had won without having to form a coalition with other parties. He was sworn in the day after the election at 8 a.m. He hopped on a plane at noon to fly up to Tokyo to make sure he can meet his counterparts for that Quad meeting. This is something that I think was probably not his first choice of first thing to do, but really important for him to be seen being up there. I would note that things are off to a really quick start, a really fast-paced start. I feel like at CSIS, we have ministers visiting us all the time, which is terrific. We have the climate minister coming at the end of the month, too. But I will note, too, that the big questions that they have in front of them are not yet answered, and the hard choices are still in front of us, including how much money they're going to put towards defense, which programs they're actually going to cut, how are they going to fill capabilities gaps that they have. I'm happy to take questions about submarines all day, although that's not my only focus here. But the submarines that they have, right, are about to run out of their lifespan before the new ones come in. So there's a big question of, this makes some sense, but we won't have what we need on the deterrence factor for quite a number of years. And whether or not there is going to be a larger U.S. footprint militarily in Australia, there probably is, but on what timeline? And in fact, when we look what's happening not only in the Solomon Islands, but across the Pacific, what actually should be the Pacific policy? What's the appropriate division of labor, resources, and attention there? So look, before concluding, I do think I want to point out, zoom out a little bit and point out some of the big trends that I think are really interesting in this, and then conclude with a pitch to all of you about why you should be knocking down Rhonda's front door to sign up for all of her classes and go to the Great Barrier Reef with her. By the way, she has a trip to the Great Barrier Reef you can go to. This sounds like the greatest group study I can ever have. I've already pitched her last night that, like, I'm willing to come for the trip. You guys should beat me to the punch. Okay, a couple of trends. First is the relationship really has, between Australia and the United States, has been turbocharged. Now, the alliance was already developing in some really interesting ways. It was broadening, but with the kind of trifecta of the 70th anniversary of AUSMIN, our official alliance, when you had, of ANZUS, of AUSMIN, which is our annual ministerial between defense and state and their counterparts, where they had a slew of announcements that are hiding in plain sight. And with AUKUS, we now kind of are moving into a new era of what this relationship will look like. Second point, somewhat ironically, I think we're going through something of a role reversal between the United States and Australia. Now, it used to be that the United States wanted Australia to be more involved in their own region, right? Cooperation in Iraq and Afghanistan, no problem. Anyone who served with the Aussies knows that's true. When we talk about cooperation in Asia, it gets a little bit more complicated because of the complexities of their trade relations. But now I actually think we're seeing the Aussies, after mounting pressure by China in multiple domains, doubling down on the United States and, in fact, agitating for the U.S. To do more in the region and to make decisions more quickly. Now, I tend to think this is a good result, right? We're asking more of each other at this point, but as we do that, there's going to be plenty of tension as we go about it. And hopefully it's tension of the productive kind, but this is a newer element in our relations with Australia. Third, I can tell you, as a man from Washington, interest in Australia and Washington is sky high. That's true in conversations across the administration, with members of Congress, with industry partners, with the media. There's a lot more attention and focus than that Australia is getting than it had got before. And that's mainly, I think, because Australia is really seen as a bellwether, right? That often Australia is the first to experience, and fairly often the first to respond to, a range of coercive measures emanating from China. Now, I will say that whatever happens in the U.S. political system moving forward, this is really interesting because parties of the left, parties of the right, both want the U.S. to have stronger allies, oftentimes for very different motivations, right? But if you want a stronger ally, either so that collectively we look stronger and we can integrate further, or because you want the United States to do less so that we can back up, Australia in some ways is the prime example and the prime mover in this space. Because as we try to empower allies, you need allies who are willing and capable, and in many ways Australia stands right at the front of the line on this. Third, or I guess fourth, I forget where I'm up to. With the new developments that we're seeing in the alliance, you also have a proliferation of new questions about the alliance, about how we figure some of these things out. There are some basic questions about AUKUS Sounds good to do, right? Integrate our allies more closely with us, but we've only shared like the crown jewels of our technology, nuclear propulsion, once in our history. We don't do that lightly. There are a lot of nuclear safety questions. There's legislation that kind of bounds what we can do. So, one of the questions is, can we figure this out? But really what AUKUS is, what it's meant to do, who it partners with, and what it delivers and on what timeline, actually, I think are going to be the questions that drive not only the U.S.-Australia alliance, but really the U.S. alliance system in Asia. So look, let me conclude in this way. When most Americans think about the Indo-Pacific region, Northeast Asia looms large in our mental maps, right? I mean, China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea. Southeast Asia also is right up in there about kind of future trends, areas that are in play over strategic competition. But oftentimes, Australia is really seen as peripheral. And additionally, because it's so recognizable, I was talking about this at dinner last night, because as an American, it's like almost the easiest place in the world to go to. It's like a little bit further than Hawaii. They speak our same language, more or less. And so you don't spend a lot of time thinking about them and actually the differences that we have with them. And I think because of that, oftentimes we take Australia for granted. And I think both of those impulses are incorrect. You could make an argument, as I am making to you, that Australia might be our most underrated ally. In Australia, we have an example, I think, of an ally pulling its weight. In Australia, we have an example of an ally that's not only willing to push back against coercion, but increasingly more capable of doing so, and that is willing to rally others along with us, right? There's nothing more harmful to U.S. interests than to let everything be about bilateral competition. It is China versus the U.S. You tell me who's going to sign on to our fight just about us. When these are issues of concern to other nations, that's when the conversation turns a little bit. And I would just say that if you're interested in the future of what America's alliance structures look like, if you're interested in middle power diplomacy, if you're interested in great power competition, and if you're interested in what the future of American statecraft in the Indo-Pacific region looks like, I would suggest to you that Australia has your name written all over it. And notwithstanding FDR's comment that it's a hell of a way off, I'd like to think that there are a few countries that are more interesting, more important to the future of American statecraft, and more worthy of your attention than Australia. So with that, that's pretty big and a pretty quick overview.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.